we're talking about how to be a good manager. So if it is your first time, please don't worry about whether you've listened to the podcast or not yet this week. I know that everyone has and they can listen. And also sometimes you're catching up depending on what else you've had going on during your week. One of my friends has just come back from holiday and he was like, oh, I've now got 2 to catch up on. So I'm glad that he was excited. And so this morning, what I thought we would do is think a little bit about when we say good, what that really means. Some of the basics of this week is some of the basics. I think the thing that I really realized when you start to look at what the basic things are is doing all of those things well is actually pretty hard. It's not an easy thing to do the basics brilliantly. So it is a thing, I think, actually with management to go back to basics. So a few questions for you just to get started. So we're going to use the annotation a fair bit this morning. Firstly, I'd just like to know whether you are a manager at the moment. So just put either a star in the yes or the no. So you are a manager at the moment. Your stars should be all come up anonymous, and you're looking for something that says view ones, annotate, then star. Please don't worry if you've not used it before. We'll give you just all a second. If you are on your phone, it doesn't work. Okay. So, Nick, you're going to be one soon. So very topical then for you. So are you a manager today? Can you hear me okay? Sounds like I was maybe a bit unstable. No, as we go through if it is cutting out today. Brilliant, thank you. I think we got to about slightly more of us being a manager than not. Do you have a manager? Which might sound like a strange question, but not all of us necessarily have a manager. So you might be working freelance, you might be your own boss, you might be running your own company. So I assume that most of us do have a manager, but I added in this question when I was thinking about this last night, because I was thinking, actually, like, I don't really feel like I have a manager anymore. But I was like, and it's interesting that we have actually got quite a lot of people who are saying, oh no, I don't feel like I've got a manager necessarily in that sort of more formal way. Interesting. And then the last question, which is a question I think we don't ask enough, is do you want to be a manager? Yes or no? Is that an aspiration for you? Do you want to be a manager? And I'm actually glad that we got some people saying no, because I think sometimes in that ladder-like world, when we thought of careers in that way, the assumption was the answer to that question should be yes. You know, we should all want to progress in a way where we were managing people. It felt like that was a default for, oh, that's what progression looks like. Jen, sometimes yes, sometimes no, maybe depending on the week or the day. Certainly my partner who ended up a manager, you know, sometimes those things happen inadvertently, then definitely realised that was what to be doing. I like leading but not managing. Yeah, that's so interesting, Katie. Coach or mentor rather than a micromanager. Yeah, I mean, nobody wants a micromanager, that's for sure. Used to want to be one, but not really anymore. Yeah, it's interesting. A leader, but not a manager. And I do think the skills that come with being a really effective manager are really important. I think sometimes this idea of like, oh, leaders feel like they are, I don't know, that word feels like sort of better in some ways than managers, but managers are just as important as leaders. I think they just do different things. And I think some of us are probably slightly better at some of the skills that go with leadership, but some of us are better at the skills that go with management. And don't want to be leaders or managers, and that's fine too. Yeah, that's how managing people in different countries, no face-to-face time. That's, I guess, things from a hybrid perspective, like that. How do you manage that? Cultural differences, the connection that doesn't come from face-to-face. So I'm glad to see that we've got some no's there in terms of we don't all want to necessarily be doing this. So let me just, yeah, I think micromanagement it's the number one thing that people don't want from managers. I think we did a podcast episode on it previously. And it's so interesting because everybody hates it, and yet it still happens. It's one of those things where it's like, we all know no one wants to be micromanaged, and yet probably at some point we all micromanage. So it's an interesting thing to explore. So let's head into chat now. I want you to think about your best ever manager. So somebody who directly managed you, and let me know in chat, what was something they repeatedly did? So when you're thinking about that person, what was the thing that you think, yeah, they repeatedly did that skill or showed that behavior, or it could be a really small thing. What was it that sort of made them a brilliant manager? Remove roadblocks, Barnaby, really like that. Constructive feedback, empower consistent check-ins, regular one-to-ones. Interesting how often that comes up. Listen to the expert, supportive, trust, regular one-to-ones, check in regularly. Yeah, some of this is about how people make you feel, trusted, supported, believing in you, from Pauline there. And some of this is some really practical things. Given space, check in, yeah, stretched you. Yeah, it's interesting. The first thing I wrote down, because I was sort of practicing this to check the question worked, is I think the thing that they did was they repeatedly, my best manager ever, repeatedly role modeled behaviors that then sort of made me increase my expectations of myself. Does that make sense? So they were good at role modeling behaviors that I believed in terms of listening, being supportive, the way that they treated people. I just sort of every day I remember thinking, oh, if I could be a bit more like that, I would sort of be even better at what I did. Yeah, it's neat to describe. Yeah, they were inspiring me. Interesting feedbacks a bit. Okay, let's just get rid of some of those stars that have popped up. Reminded you of the big picture. And what's the one thing you'd like managers to do more of? It doesn't necessarily have to be your manager today. You might have a brilliant manager. You might not have a manager today. But if there was one thing, so let's try and kind of keep it to one thing. If we were thinking about one thing we really want to help managers just be better at, what's the first thing that springs to mind? So Sarah saying communicate. Yeah, you can sort of probably never communicate too much, I think. Feedback, check-ins, clarity of development, that's interesting. Support and genuinely care. Yeah, so maybe this goes back a bit to radical candor. You know, we've seen feedback come up. Care personally and challenge directly. That's interesting, Rachel. Be realistic about what's possible. Word clarity coming up a lot. And I think if you are a manager, this also starts to give you some really good questions to keep asking your team. Because you imagine if, let's say now, I was all of your managers and I just asked you this question. So if I just said to all of you, what's the one thing I could do more of to do your job even better? So what's the one thing I could do more of to help you do your job? And I got some of these responses, and loads of people in my team were saying more communication. It gives me very specific and useful feedback that I can do something with. One of the things that's often missing when we think about managers is how often are managers asking these kind of questions. They're sort of coaching questions that give us useful feedback that we can act on. Also, you can ask, strengths-based feedback questions as a manager as well. What's the thing that I do that's most helpful for you? I remember I used to ask that question a lot. I used to always ask, what do I do that helps you do your job? And what's the one thing I could do that would help you do your job even better? I'd always ask those questions. It was sort of a what's working well and an even better if question. And I would often get wrong was where I was being most helpful was often not the thing where I was being most helpful. And so what it helps you to understand, and we've talked about this idea before, is the difference between your intent and your impact. So I might think, oh, well, all the team really appreciate this, my strategic abilities. That's where I'm being brilliant as a manager. Maybe I think, oh, I really help people to zoom out because I'm a good strategic thinker. And I would think about myself. If all the team say to me, the thing that really helps us is when you build really good relationships cross-functionally. It unlocks things for us. It removes barriers, makes our jobs easier. And I might have either taken that for granted or not appreciated the positive impact that was having. And so just by asking that question, it helps me to figure out, well, what do I need to keep doing? What do I need to do more of? And also, what am I missing? I think that point about what am I missing How can I encourage people to just be talking to me about these things in terms of what I'm doing well, what I could do even better? Useful to think about as well whether you're going to do this anonymously or ask people to talk to you in their one-to-ones. I often think it's good to start anonymously, even if you feel like you've got a high trust team, because it just gives people that space to say whatever they think and to not kind of feel that worry of, people often get really worried about, I don't want to upset someone. Easier, I appreciate, to do if you've got a slightly bigger team. If you've only got 3 people, anonymous is always quite hard because I think people think there's only 3 of us. The other way that I would do this, and certainly the way that I always used to do this, is I would let people know the questions and I would come back to them once a month in a one-to-one. So we would do weekly one-to-ones, and once a month in those one-to-ones, I would say, I'm going to ask you the same 2 questions, in our first one-to-one every month. So people knew they were coming and they could prepare for them. Because I think putting people on the spot feels a bit unfair. And once people knew they were coming, they sort of got used to having their answers ready for me. So they'd sort of come with the answers like ready for the one-to-one. And I tried initially doing it weekly, and that felt too frequent. So also try out the sort of frequency with which you're kind of asking for this feedback. When I did it every week, sort of things didn't change enough. And I think it felt a bit too repetitive. Whereas once a month felt like regularly enough to be useful. That's weird. My light just went off. Let's turn that back on. There we go. Ish. Right. So in the podcast this week, we talked about these 5 different areas from the Gallup report, which was sort of the basics of brilliant management. Now, the more I have thought about this, the more I'm not sure whether basics is the right word, because I think each of these are big areas in their own right. So as a manager, what I would be trying to do if I was looking at these 5 areas, I would think, what do I already do well? Where is my biggest opportunity to improve? What's the gap that I've got here? What might I not naturally do really, really well? So let's go through each of those areas. Okay. So the first one is about motivating action. So you motivate people to take action. I guess this would come from clarity, clarity of like what needs to happen, but also things as we've described today, like removing barriers. It's much more motivating to take action if you feel like those barriers are not going to get in your way, if you feel like you've got somebody on your side. And some of these I think are connected. The next one, which I think is probably 2 things in one, is about being clear on outcomes and being able to overcome adversity. And this is in the Gallup report, and we'll send a link to that so you've all got that. I'm just going to put my main light on because I feel like my house is falling down around me. This is what happens. My partner's gone away for a few days, and if it all falls out, I've got no idea how to fix anything. So there'll just be me just putting a message on Pod Plus saying, come and save me, things working. So yeah, second area is about outcomes and overcoming adversity. So this is the point about being very clear on the what and giving lots of people freedom on the how. People want clarity on the what and they want freedom on the how. I've seen that time and time again. It also comes from Tammy Erickson, London Business School professor. I remember her saying that to me before. That's what we really look for from our leaders. So have you worked really hard together on objectives and outcomes, and you help people overcome those obstacles, inevitable obstacles along the way? Which almost, as I said, I feel like is kind of 2 things in one, because outcomes is one thing and sort of overcoming adversity is sort of another. Next one is about accountability. Accountability is a tough one, and it's one that we hear lots of people. If you went and spoke to lots of managers, and lots of you here are managers, it's a challenge because you'll think, how do I help people to have more accountability? It's sort of a perpetual problem that we hear from people. And one way to help people have more accountability is to do this really well. So I think lots of these things are interconnected and interdependent. So when we have clear outcomes, when we know what we're trying to do, then it's much, much easier to have that shared accountability. So we all know what we are here to contribute, and we also know how the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts. So I know the part that I've got to play in our team, and I know how that then contributes to what we are trying to achieve collectively as a team, which helps us to feel more accountable. I think it's an interesting area to maybe think about even more. Next one, which we have done a lot of work on, is trust. So high trust teams, we've done episodes on high trust teams. You can listen to Amy Edmondson who I interviewed on the podcast, talk about psychological safety. And that is a really big topic in its own right, which has almost challenged my own thinking a bit this week on, are these really the basics? Because each of these are pretty big areas. But I think if you've got a high trust team where people feel like they can be themselves, where there's belonging, where there's the safety and security where people can be themselves, it gives everyone the ability to behave in the way that lots of you've described today. So if you want feedback to flow, you need a high trust team. Yeah, fundamentals perhaps is a better description, Mark. I've rebranded it even within the last 24 hours of thinking about it, because we actually challenged ourselves of thinking, is this podcast too basic? And then my head has I've changed direction 180 degrees. Really nice bit there from Katie. Could this also about trusting yourself? Yes. So interestingly, not in the context of the Gallup research. The Gallup research is, have you as a manager created a high trust environment? But I think if you looked at the question from the other side of the coin, what helps you to be a good manager? Having confidence and self-belief is definitely part of that. So that's a really nice kind of alternative approach in terms of, we're really thinking here about what does it mean to be a good manager, but also what sets you up for success as a manager. So I think, yeah, that's a really good build. And then the last one is decisions that are based on what's best for the business. So this is, you feel like your manager takes decisions which, they are clearly connected to what you're trying to achieve. You don't feel like your manager is doing something that is political, or because they feel they have to. They're sort of standing up for, well, this is what we're trying to achieve, and we're making decisions kind of in pursuit of those objectives and outcomes. This model reminds me of, let me know what VACC stands for. I don't think I know off the top of my head. That doesn't ring a bell. So expand on that a little bit more for us, because that'd be really useful. Maybe there's a good connection we can make there. And I think one of the things that we talked about in the podcast this week is this point around decisions. Sometimes you do make decisions, I think, as a manager that might not immediately seem obvious to the team, like why that's important, why that's the right decision to make. But if you show your workings, and we describe this as one of the ideas for action for this week, if you explain to people, this is why we are doing this, almost like get under the bonnet of particularly big decisions that might not be obvious to teams, that means more sense of confidence in you and clarity, and you probably get more trust as a result. Visionary, architect, coach, catalyst. Oh, a system shader. Thanks, Kate. I don't think I've come across that before. That sounds like that would be, that sounds like a podcast episode in its own right. Transparency on the why. Yeah, is a really, why are we making these decisions? Probably we've all worked for managers where we think, maybe are they too easily swayed by things that are sort of less objective, that are maybe by the politics or by other people elsewhere, and then we lose a sense of confidence and trust because of that. And also we understand why that might be. I've definitely made some decisions very pragmatic in the past, where I would think, well, I feel like this in the short term is the right thing for us to do, but really important to explain to the team why, because it might not be immediately obvious. Like, which of those decisions everyone will get straight away why we might be doing something? What are those decisions where you do need to show your workings? So just looking at those 5 areas now, which, as I say, I think are sort of, as Mark described, these are really big fundamentals, I think, in their own right. Let me know now, of these ones, which one do you think is the hardest for managers? For you as a manager, or when you're thinking about your manager, let me know in chat, which of these do you think is the hardest to do well? Let me just clear those. Yeah, maybe you can either put a star on my screen, or if you want to expand on it a bit more in chat, either way. Maybe it might be quite nice actually for us to visually see it on the screen. So which one of these feels like the hardest? I think when we talked about it, Helen and I talked about it this week, Helen said she thought this one, the accountability one, is the hardest. It's interesting. Quite a few people saying the decisions, the outcomes, the overcoming adversity, trust. I sometimes think this one, or certainly experience, gets deprioritized in favor of the day-to-day, because this is a bit about pressing pause and having a lot and spending the time to get the clarity on objectives and key results if you use AKRs, key performance indicators, or goals for the year. And so often we just keep going, or we do them once and then we sort of forget about them and we don't get them out until a year later. So I think from my perspective, certainly, however we do goals or outcomes with roles as a manager, you make those living and breathing, like not disappear into a file or into a drawer for the year. Because I think if you do that well, it also helps with the accountability point. Yeah, Katie, if you're in a very political environment, then decisions end up being quite political. Making decisions that's best for the project. Yeah, that's a nice way of framing it, of thinking about it. Yeah, I've had feedback. So Corinne saying accountability, where you want people to sort of leave their very sort of maybe stricter day-to-day responsibilities at the door. I've heard that from quite a few people recently in different organizations. And I think it's a really tough balance, because you don't want people to feel like they have to work loads more hours or do lots of things that really kind of blur their boundaries. And at the same time, we are asking people to sort of have judgment and the sensing to know when to support or maybe prioritize. So the thing that I'm often talking to teams about at the moment is that sense of how can we make sure the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts, and be really transparent about priorities. So let's say I've got a priority where it's clear I need some support. The team understands and takes the initiative to think, actually, I'm going to help Sarah with that, because I know that's more important than what I've got in my day-to-day just for now, for this week or for this month. But it's done in a very sort of collaborative way. And it doesn't just mean about additive. It can't just mean working longer. It's working smarter. I've just read Essentialism. I don't know if any of you have read Essentialism. And that's really interesting on this point about accountability and an initiative. How do we do the most essential things, the right things in the right order? Yeah. How to promote initiative in the team. Yeah, that's interesting. We came up with an initiative spectrum, Adam. That sounds great. I think sometimes as well, like being really clear on, like we've talked before about the experiment to execution scale, maybe something kind of quite similar about going, well, we want, these are the areas where you've got loads of freedom to try things out. And these are the areas where we just need to execute. Yeah, let's talk about that a bit more. I'll think about, we probably won't do initiative straight away because it'll perhaps feel too similar, but I do like that, like how to take initiative yourself. We've done creating challenge in your career, but that feels more career-based, I think, rather than day-to-day. Interesting. So just a few ideas for action for you, just before we finish. So the first thing is to really think about involve, don't solve as a manager. And I have definitely fallen into this trap. Your job is not to do everything for everyone else, especially not if you're a doer, and especially not if you've listened to podcasts before and you are prone to adopting other people's monkeys, especially as a first-time manager. Don't be really careful not to end up managing everybody's monkeys in the desire to be helpful and as a doer. I think but we are always more committed to actions and ideas that we come up with for ourselves. So if we want people to have more accountability, to take more initiative, we need to involve people as much as we can in setting objectives, in goal setting, in some of those questions that we talked about. So involve, don't solve. Second thing, which we've chatted a little bit about already today, is be work in progress. I think if you have to make a difficult decision that you feel probably is more political, and these things do happen, if you can try and signal that to your team without being uncomfortable or unprofessional, I think that's a useful thing to do. I think people understand that sometimes you have to do things that are not ideal. So I think just let people know when a decision might not be obvious, how can you explain that decision to the team so people understand why you've done what you've done? And then people get it. And I think people have empathy for, okay, we can't always do things in a very black and white world. There are lots of shades of grey. And the last thing, as a manager, just always remember that stories and the stuff that people can't see will develop trust in a way that facts and data and learning goals and all that kind of thing will never do. I mentioned it briefly on the podcast. I sometimes run a program based on Why Should Anyone Be Led By You? The book, Why Should Anyone Be Led By You? And one of the things that we do at the end of that program is get people to share their stories, their leadership stories. And the stories that you hear in response to that question, I sort of said to people, have you ever shared those with your team? And most people haven't. And so if you want to develop a high trust team, think about how can you share the stuff that people don't see. Some of those stories, the highs, the lows, the failures, you don't have to do it all at once because that could be really intense. But I think the best managers that I've worked with, and I hope that I've done this as well, think of when are those moments to share stories so that we can connect and develop that trust. And also remind people that you're not perfect either. People still have this perception of once you're in a management role, oh, well, they know all of the answers and everything goes really well for them all of the time. And obviously that's not true for any of us. It doesn't matter what level that we're at. So maybe just 3 ideas for action for you. And we expand on those a bit more in the podcast if you've not had a chance to listen yet this week. So sorry, stop and starty this morning, but I hope that still felt helpful. Next week, we are talking about it's Learning Work Week next week. And we're talking about ways you could spend learning money or ways that you could learn if you've got no money. So we've actually been really specific in next week's podcast about courses, communities, curiosity, how you can sort of how to invest in your learning. So that's what's coming up next week. So thank you all so much for joining and thank you for bearing with me a bit this morning. I hope it wasn't too disruptive. And you have now seen my love balloon, which apparently I'm never allowed to pop. So, and it really doesn't go with the aesthetic. So I'm really trying to, get over myself with that. Thank you all so much. Have a good rest of your Thursday. Enjoy the sunshine. Bye, everyone.